I ran across a good joke, and I thought I'd share it with you this morning. How many meat eaters does it take to change a light bulb? Any guesses? None. They prefer to stay in the dark. Don't worry. I know you didn't like that one, but in case you thought I was going to stand up here today and just pick on the carnivores, here's one to even the score. How many vegans does it change to take a light bulb? None. Vegans can't change anything. Guys, those were really harsh. It's easy to believe that ethical eating begins and ends with whether or not you choose to eat animal meat. But in reality, there are many, many facets to eating ethically, and choosing whether or not to eat meat is just one of them. Albert Schweitzer said, "A person is ethical only when life, as such, is sacred, that of plants and animals as that of other men and women, and when one devotes oneself helpfully to all life that is in need of help." Now, seeing animals and plants as sacred doesn't mean that we don't eat them. After all, if we didn't eat plants, none of us would be here. But do we treat their lives as sacred? Do we ensure they, meaning animals, are treated humanely during their lives and their deaths? Do we grow and harvest plants responsibly and sustainably, with appreciation for them and for how they nurture our bodies? We all like to envision ourselves as ethical people, but how are we living into our view of ourselves? I think it's important, before we delve any further into the issue, that we first examine our own Unitarian Universalist identity and how it plays into this discussion. I imagine there are quite a few people who consider ourselves to be free thinkers here. People who might say, "I'm uneasy with all this talk of ethical eating because I don't want to be involved with a church that tells me what to eat, how to eat, and with whom to eat. That's not what we do in liberal religion." If this is describing your thought process, take heart. You are correct, and I empathize with your concerns. There are indeed many religious organizations that have established dietary codes for religious reasons. Mormons famously shun caffeine. Seventh-day Adventists do not eat meat. Some Hindus ban all meat and others just cows. Muslims cannot drink alcohol or eat pork. Orthodox Jews do not eat pork, nor do they combine dairy and meat dishes. And some of you might remember a time when the Roman Catholics were told that it was a sin to eat meat on certain days. Some religions have the restrictions for seemingly arbitrary reasons, some to maintain a clear mind and clean body, and others for compassion toward animals or theological reasoning. And others, specifically the Judeo-Christian faith, did so to prevent illness and death before we had a hygienic way to cook, clean, and store meat properly. In other words, food safety was such an important topic that those in power literally made it a part of Scripture to ensure their rules would be obeyed. So yes, I completely understand that religion and food has a long, tangled history that most UUs would like to stay far, far away from. Luckily, things are different here. The Unitarian Universalist Association is not a creedal organization and promotes the full participation in all of its activities without requiring adherence to any particular interpretation of religion or to any particular religious belief or creed. The words appear in our association's bylaws and rules. So our association will not establish a dietary code. And no, you won't be told to stop eating hamburgers. And you won't be told to avoid bacon and pork chops. And yes, you'll probably be offered a cup of coffee during the coffee hour. You won't be told to sign a temperance pledge. If you're an adult and if you want to drink alcoholic beverages at a bar or at a restaurant, you won't be condemned by our association. If I, as the minister, see a pack of cigarettes in your pocket or purse, you won't be excommunicated. Though I will judge you harshly for drinking a Pepsi over a Coke. Kidding, or am I? Now that we've established that as UUs, we are free to eat how we choose, how might we choose to eat that is best in line with our principles and ethics? The whole idea behind the concept of ethical eating is that we think about the food that we're putting into our mouths. And by this, I don't mean the nutritional value, whether it's good or tasty for us, and whether it's going straight from our lips to our hips. Ethical eating is consumption wedded to awareness and intention. It's about educating ourselves about the true costs of the foods that we buy and consume. It's about facing up to the ugly facts about the agri-industrial complex. It's knowing, for example, that while we've increased the average yield of an acre of farmland from 24 bushels of corn in 1930 to more than 160 bushels per acre today, to achieve this astonishing improvement, we apply about 1.5 billion pounds of nitrogen to the soil each year in the form of fertilizer. And that about half of that nitrogen is taken up into the atmosphere and falls as acid rain, or stays up there as greenhouse gases, or it washes into our watersheds, causing massive algae blooms that choke off other aquatic life. I recognize the potential trade-off inherent in that information. It makes it seem like we can make enough food to feed the ever-increasing number of people inhabiting the earth, but do damage to the environment in the process, or protect the environment and allow for a portion of the population to go without food. Here's one thing though, I think we have a bit more wiggle room than we're willing to acknowledge. There are ways in which we can both increase our food production and protect our environment. Dorothy Blair, a professor of nutrition studies at Penn State, wrote a paper enumerating 6 goals toward attaining a sustainable food system. They are: eat lower on the food chain, which would have positive impact on health, land use, water quality, and soil conservation. This one's pretty straightforward. Using large animals to fulfill your protein requirements requires large plots of land, even more water, and even more food. In fact, 70% of the grain produced goes to feeding livestock. That same land could supply far more food with far fewer resources if it were producing plant-based crops. Or that grain could go directly to people who need it rather than livestock. But to eat lower on the food chain would mean we'd need to reevaluate our very American way of eating. Primarily our much celebrated meat with a side of meat diet. You know, bacon-wrapped steaks stuffed with more bacon, decorated perhaps with a sprig of greenery. Turduckens. And a triple Whopper Big Mac meal and such. Not only is our obsession with meat unhealthy for us, consider the antibiotics, growth hormones, pesticides, and other chemicals that that animal has ingested that will now become a part of your body. It's unhealthy for our environment too. The second way we can create a more sustainable food system is to eat and act to promote good farming and fishing practices. And that means to reward those who do it well. This translates practically as buying products from responsible companies. Now, for those who eat meat because they like it and they're not particularly distressed by the factory farming process, which I should say is my husband, so I totally empathize, this is where respect for human life comes in. It's now a well-known fact that a significant portion of the seafood we consume in the US has been, at one point or another in the production cycle, handled by modern-day slaves. Whether it's the fishers, the preparers, the shippers, or the chefs, slavery is a byproduct of our incessant quest for the cheapest food possible. In order to combat this, we put our money where our mouth is and where our values are, and buy from companies dedicated to paying their workers living wages and harvesting seafood and any other product in a sustainable way. Ideally buying from sources we are familiar with and able to verify with our own 2 eyes. The third goal is to reduce food processing and packaging energy. We do this by eating food as close to their original fresh state as possible. Now, I admit I am guilty of buying those pre-sliced vegetables all conveniently packaged from time to time. It saves time and energy on my part, but it's totally in line with my values to go out of my way. I have to get a knife and cut it up myself. Who wants to do that? But really, it's not in line with my values, yet all of the extra packaging. The fourth goal is to reduce transportation energy, somewhat what Chelsea went over in her story. We can do this by eating locally produced meats, milk, grains, fruits, and vegetables whenever possible. This goes a long way with the second goal. By buying locally, we can not only ensure the company adheres to our standards of human rights, but it saves on the gas and environmental wear and tear that buying transported goods creates. Realistically, this isn't always possible. And we're not going to likely stop at a restaurant and ask them exactly where this potato came from. But when possible, and when you have the choice, trying to support mom and pop places nearest you. The fifth goal is to reduce food waste. In 2016, a report by The Guardian found that an astonishing 50% of US produce is thrown away. That translates to 60 billion tons. And the EPA found that uneaten food constituted the single biggest occupant in landfills in the US. This means that the annual amount of food waste for the average American family of 4 is $1,600 a year. And we can combat this troubling waste of food by buying sparingly and using leftovers. And really, this isn't too much to ask when you consider how tasty cold pizza, Chinese food, and other dishes are the next day. The last goal is to eat for social justice by supporting fair trade initiatives that promote fair prices and sustainable production practices. How much are you willing to sacrifice in order to ensure that your neighbor can have food on their table or can afford clothing for their children? If our highest priority remains the cost of our food, chances are we're unknowingly participating in a system that promotes unfair practices for their workers and for the environment. Remember, you pay for what you get. As UUs, we're aware of our responsibility in addressing the concerns of ethical eating. In 2011, the UUA released a statement of conscience on it. In the statement, we acknowledge that as Unitarian Universalists, we are called to address our relationship with food. Our principles call for recognition of and respect for the other. As we search freely and responsibly for truth, meaning, and spiritual wholeness, we will make a variety of individual choices about food. Ethical eating is the application of our principles to our food choices. What and how we eat has broad implications for our planet and society. Our values, principles, and integrity call us to seek compassion, health, and sustainability in the production of food and how we raise it. As individuals and as congregations, we recognize the need to examine the impact of our food choices and our practices and make changes that will lighten the burden we place on the world. We also recognize that many food decisions will require us to make trade-offs between competing priorities. These priorities include taste, selection, price, human health, environmental protection, sustainability, adequate food supply, humane treatment of animals used for food, and fair treatment of farm and food workers. At the bottom of the statement, there was a call to action for congregations, and it reads, as congregations, we aspire to provide and sell more plant-based, organic, locally produced, and fair trade foods at congregational events. Promote economic accessibility to safe, ethically produced food. Support the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, Unitarian Universalist United Nations Office, and others in their effort to ensure that everyone has adequate, nutritious food produced sustainably. Provide educational programs. Become green sanctuaries. Advocate for healthful food for school and other institutional meals. How have we done as a congregation? Have we done any of this? I think we have. Is there room for improvement? There always is room for improvement, I think. Some things to ponder. Before I close, I'd like to touch on one more area directly related to how we eat: hunger and malnutrition. As I mentioned before, we waste about 3,044 pounds of food per second in the United States. Each year, 27% of U.S. food produced for human consumption is lost at the retail, consumer, and food service levels. Globally, 4.3 pounds of food are produced daily for every woman, man, and child on the earth, enough to make us all nice and chunky. Yet every year, 6 million children across the globe die as a result of hunger and malnutrition. One child dying every 5 seconds. Hunger and malnutrition are responsible for more deaths in the world than AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis combined. It's important to note that for some of us and for some of our neighbors, buying in a manner closest to our ethical standards is simply out of reach. For many, buying organic or locally grown foods are too pricey and would require a sacrifice too great. I acknowledge this, and I wish I had a solution that seems more instantly satisfying. But what I can say is, for those of you that can afford to buy in a sustainable way, it's important that we do so. We can change market patterns, we can make food justice a priority that big businesses pay attention to. Ultimately, I believe if we do so, we can make healthy and sustainable products more attainable for everyone. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes the human right to food, to secure personal health and well-being, and it has been said that one of the major obstacles to eradication of hunger is political will. This cannot continue to be so. How is it that people still die of hunger when we waste so much? Ultimately, how you eat and what you eat is your choice. Sid Baumel, the editor of the website eatkind.net, which just seems so nice, says, ethical eating, like ethical living, is not about absolutes. It's about doing the best you're willing and able to do, and nurturing a will to keep doing better. The best you're willing and able to do. So what are you willing and what are you able to do to begin eating ethically? Okay, because you begged for it. Can I tell you a vegan joke? I promise it won't be cheesy. What did the vegan zombie say when he was hungry? Grains, grains. That's it. Amen. Our closing words are from Max Coots, who's a minister emeritus at the UU Church of Canton, New York. It's called Litany of Gratitude. The harvest will be an attitude, not a time of year. And maybe I'll be wise enough to feel a sort of litany of gratitude for seeds that, like memories and minds, keep in themselves, the recollection of what they were and the power to become something more than they are. For soil, that accumulation of lives piled up by death that gives new life. For the justice of the earth that gave me about as many weeds and wilt and scab and bugs as vegetables, but in the end gave me enough for what I needed. For hands, those miracles on the ends of my arms that let me tend my vegetables and pull my weeds, and for my mind enough to know the difference between the two. For calluses, life's defense against that softness that makes survival difficult. For the ability to work and the will to work and the work to do and the time to do it in. And finally, for that sense of kinship to it all, that singleness, that unity that is the basis of faith.